Good evening, everyone. Here we are again on Tuesday evening at 6 o'clock for my mostly weekly Facebook Live. So if you're able to join me live, thank you so much. And if you're watching this on catch up by another means, again, thank you. I hope you find this interesting. So tonight, I like to sort of keep a track of awareness days. And today is World Diabetes Day, and it's such a significant condition that's developing and escalating around the world. And whilst I talk a lot around different aspects to do around this topic, I thought it'd be very helpful just to come back to some of the fundamental basics. And as I called this, so that you don't become a statistic, because the statistics are quite staggering around this now, around the world, but let's focus here in the UK. So currently, according to the charity Diabetes UK, there are currently estimated to be 5 million people of the UK population living with diabetes. Some of those are probably living with the condition and yet don't realize it. So that's dangerous in its own right. But a large proportion of those have already been diagnosed of having actual type 2 diabetes. There's probably, and I know I'm talking to clients, there's a lot more people who are becoming sort of almost borderline. That's when often people might contact me because they're concerned about the risk of moving into full-blown diabetes that then would need to be managed. So 5 million currently today, and it's estimated that there's another 2.4 million people at risk. We've currently got in the population 1 in 14 people living with diabetes. Now, there are two main types. There's type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is more of an autoimmune condition, so I'm not focusing on that. But when we bear in mind that 90% of those 5 million are of the people with type 2 diabetes, which is by and large a diet and lifestyle condition, then there is plenty that I can talk to you about. But I want to focus on what this is, why this day came about, how you can manage it, what you really need to think about so that you can take steps to avoid becoming one of these alarming statistics. It is a serious condition. I'm not going to talk about the long-term risk. Let's just to say you don't want to be living with type 2 diabetes that may potentially lead to you having medication and over time needing more and more stronger types of medication. Let's not get to that stage. So World Diabetes Day, how did it come about? It's always on the 14th of November, and it's in recognition of Sir Frederick Banting, who discovered insulin on the 14th of November in 1922, I think it is. So we're over 100th anniversary of the discovery of insulin. And why is insulin so relevant? Well, of course, I'm sure you're aware, you may always associate insulin with diabetes. Well, it's not as simple as that. But of course, we know that insulin is vitally important to keeping our blood glucose levels under control. So what is type 2 diabetes? Well, we have to keep our glucose in the bloodstream stable throughout the day. This term I often use called homeostasis, where we need to keep blood glucose levels stable throughout the day. It's dangerous if it goes too high or too low for the body to cope with. And therefore, insulin has a very important role. It utilizes glucose by taking it to the cells. Effectively, I describe it as sort of knocking on the doors of our cells to say, here's some glucose. Are you going to accept the glucose to be used for energy creation? And if the cells do not want all that glucose, then insulin will take it to the liver, or take it to muscles to try and use it there. If not, it can be taken to the liver and excess can be converted to triglyceride fat. And that's when we get into the fat storage situation. Now, if your glucose levels are running too high over a long period of time, then more and more insulin may be called upon for messages in the brain to say, look, there's too much glucose. We need to try and clear some of this glucose out of the bloodstream. So if you can imagine insulin knocking on the doors of cells to repeatedly ask on a continuous basis for cells to take this glucose, that eventually it may not need it. And if you think you'd get fed up of continuously being asked for something that you just don't need, that's a very simplistic way of talking about insulin resistance. It's effectively the cells no longer responding to the signal from insulin to take the glucose, even if over time they are then going to need it. So we then get into a situation where glucose is going to remain too high in the bloodstream. And over time, you could get into a situation where the pancreas is no longer releasing the insulin that's needed. It all can become wrapped up. Cells don't respond to insulin. The pancreas is, the message goes from the brain, oh, there's too much glucose, need more insulin. Insulin gets released into the bloodstream. The cells aren't responding. Glucose stays too high. Over time, the pancreas may not be responding and producing the insulin. The overall effect is that your glucose in the bloodstream is going to remain dangerously too high, and we need to get it under control. So fundamentally, that is what is type 2 diabetes, is that your blood glucose levels remains too high. It will always peak a little bit after eating, but after a while it needs to come back down again. And it's when it doesn't come back down, we talk about fasting glucose blood tests, that's the sign that your body's no longer responding and it can't deal with this excess glucose, or just not even excess, there's just the glucose is not being dealt with. So what is fundamentally the main causes of glucose being too high? Let's think about the foods. What creates glucose in the bloodstream? It comes from carbohydrate sources. And when we think about the main carbohydrate sources that are potentially going to lead to glucose running too high on a long-term basis, first of all, of course, sweet and sugary food. We need to think about biscuits and cake and ice cream, and sweets and chocolate and all those things that we may well love that are creeping into the diet on a too consistent basis. So it doesn't matter if you make foods at home, that if you make your own cakes, you make your own biscuits, doesn't matter. There's still a lot of sugar in those foods. And of course, it's simple sugars, very little digestion involved, can very quickly flood the bloodstream. So of course, we would think straight away about those. But we also need to think about complex carbohydrates, starchy carbohydrates. We need to think about all those foods that are starchy and therefore contain a lot of sugars, even if to start with, they're not in a simple sugar form. They have to be broken down and digested a little bit, but there's such a lot of sugars in them that eventually they're going to flood the bloodstream. So here, of course, we're talking about bread, we're talking about pasta, potatoes, other root vegetables like parsnips, even sweet potatoes in excess, even beetroot, rice, any sort of grain, even porridge oats. Even though you may think that it's very complex and there's a lot of fiber, it's still a grain. There is still quite a lot of sugar potentially that can be released from that grain when it's digested and into the bloodstream. So you've got to look at the totality of all those starchy foods, the starchy grains, the starchy root vegetables, and look at how much of those that you're eating. The next thing on the list is things like honey. Now, I'm sorry to say that people will often assume that because you're having honey or a Manuka honey, and again, it's a natural source, or we know Manuka honey might have very good immunity properties, it is still honey. It is still sugar, and you must be really, really careful of those sugary foods. Fruits, fruit juices, dried fruit, smoothies, if they're just the smoothie, it doesn't matter if it's banana and kale in there. There's a lot of banana, there's a lot of sugar in a starchy banana. Tropical fruits, a lot of sugars in those tropical fruits, and grapes. Be very careful of smoothies, fruit juices. Don't be misled by the fact that it's fruit, the fact that it might seem healthy. There's a lot of sugar. Then we need to think about hidden sugars. So the hidden sugars are very often going to be in our processed foods. I've spoken before about the fact that in the UK, on average, our daily intake from processed foods and ultra processed foods is 50% of our calorific intake on a daily basis. It's way too high. Now, there's a lot of other bad things around ultra processed foods, but they can contain a lot of hidden sugars. Why do they put so much sugar in ultra processed foods? Well, it helps to make them palatable. It helps them to make them want us to eat them. So think about buying packets of soups, tins of soups, in crisps. Okay, crisp is a potato, but look at all the sugars that they might add to add that lovely flavor that make you want to eat more and more of them. So be careful with that. Look at any processed food. And when I say a processed food, I mean anything that doesn't look like the food that you would eat in its purest form. A carrot, for example, a potato, if a piece of meat. If you're buying something that is a pie, it's in a dish, it's ready made in some way, and it's processed, therefore there is often hidden sugars added to it. Be very careful of those. Be careful of alcohol. We know there's a lot of sugars in different alcohols, and you can look at the calorific intake, and often the calorific intake with an alcohol will relate very much back to the sugar content in those. So those are the foods that we need to be really careful. And it's a good idea to go away and just keep a little food diary. Don't overthink it to start with. Just keep eating how you normally eat, but really log what you're eating every day and think back to how much of that was starchy foods, the fruits, the simple sugars, and the processed foods as well. And of course, the alcohol. Just have a little look, because you may be unpleasantly surprised by the intake of sugars collectively that you're consuming in a day when you're not even aware of it, because you think you're being healthy and you think you're doing the right thing. So what do we need to do once we've got a bit more of an understanding about the concept of these sugars, potentially sort of hidden, we're not aware of them? Then we can start to think about either cutting down or thinking about how we can switch some things out and make some sensible changes to how we're eating. First and foremost, we need to think about, are we getting enough proteins in our diet? Many people are filling up on some of these other foods I've just spoken about because they're not filling themselves up enough on protein foods. Proteins will definitely keep you much fuller and satiated between meals, and will stop you reaching for other snacks and things between meals. And often people might think about eating a jacket potato, for example, or a bowl of pasta without thinking about, is there enough protein in that meal? That's really, really important. So think about focusing on proteins. We're thinking about the meats, and the fish and eggs, even corn, even pulses. Now, I know pulses will have a little bit of starchy carbs with them, but there's a lot of fiber and there's a lot of protein in pulses. You know, they're talking about the kidney beans and the chickpeas and things like that, and lentils. The good protein source to be eating. Even a little bit of cheese and goat's cheese is a good protein source. We need to think about our fats. We can have nuts and seeds and avocados. They're also going to keep you full, and they're not going to be contributing to a risk of diabetes. Fats are very, very good at also keeping you full and slowing the speed that sugars get digested and move into the bloodstream. So are you eating those on a daily basis? Are you eating a little bit of fats with every meal? Are you cooking with olive oil, a good quality fat to be cooking with? And is protein there at every single meal that you're eating? And then think about cutting back on those starchy carbs. Do you need as much as you're eating, or are you substituting the starchy carbs for the protein, as I just mentioned above? Are you focusing on the whole grains? You know, it's very easy to go out and buy a French stick baguette because it's tasty and it's white bread. But you just getting simple sugars where every time you eat white bread and isn't delivering any fiber. Fiber will also slow the speed that sugars are released and contain a lot of other nutritional goodness that you need. White bread has no place to play in our diets at all, as indeed I would say does white pasta. Be very, very careful. Try and choose the whole grain versions as much as you can. Do you have a craving for sweet food? I promise you, you can get over a sweet craving pretty quickly. I would say in 3 or 4 days, you can get over a sweet craving. And the best way to start is to get it out of the house to start with. So the temptation is not there. Initially, if you have a sweet craving, it's much better to have a little bit of fruit, whether it's a little satsuma, maybe a plum, maybe some berries, to really help you along so that you are trying to satisfy that sweet craving without having too much of unnatural sugars, and trying to choose the fruits that are much lower in sugar, like the berries, for example. But I promise you, very, very quickly, you overcome that sugary habit. Your taste buds change really quickly and you won't get that craving from them. And just finally, I can't talk too much in a very short live. What time is it now? Yeah, I've already been talking for nearly 20 minutes. So the 3 other things that I would really ask you to think about if you're going to sit down and have a review. Number 1, are you snacking often and frequently between your main meals? It is much better to be eating a balanced, good quality breakfast, lunch, and dinner than skipping a meal like breakfast and getting hungry mid-morning and having a snack, and 2 hours later having some lunch, and then a couple of hours after that having another snack. Because the snacking action is going to be contributing to raise blood sugar, it's going to be contributing to the release of insulin, and potentially contributing to this yo-yoing effect with your blood sugar, insulin release, etc. Snacking is the one thing that I'd love everybody to try and ditch as much as possible. So it's better to have a good breakfast, get the protein in your breakfast. Think about having some nuts and seeds with some cereal. Think about having eggs for breakfast. It really doesn't take that much time. If you're going to have a piece of bread and toast because it's quick, could you add some cheese to it? Because even that's better than just Marmite on toast because there's no protein with it. So have a little think about that. So watch the snacking. Next one, get moving. This does not mean a high intensity workout. It means getting up and away from your desk and off the sofa, and moving around as much as you can throughout the day. There is a lot of research, and I've blogged and talked about this before, in my YouTube channel, about movement over exercise, because a lot of research shows that we help the uptake of glucose into our cells, helping to keep our blood sugar level more stable, really, really helping to avoid insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. So you've got to get moving throughout the day, little and often. And the final thing, which is another topic in its own right, is what can you do to try and help manage your stress levels? Living in the 21st century, stress is all around us. What are you going to do to try and take back a little bit of control over stress so that stress isn't controlling your life and you're taking more of a control around the stress in your life? What can you do to help to reduce the stress that you feel? Deep breathing, taking a walk, blogged about this a lot. Anything that you can do that is going to calm the body down, because that is yet another contributory factor in creating raised glucose in the bloodstream through the mechanism of the stress response. So I hope that's given you some useful tidbits tonight to really think carefully about actions that you can take to go and reflect on, How much are you doing to manage the amount of glucose that's going into your bloodstream every moment of every day? And what you can do to take some steps to minimize that so that you really, really, really don't become one of the huge number of statistics in the UK. And if you are already living with type 2 diabetes or very borderline, following these steps in a very careful, controlled way, particularly if you're on medication, can really go a long way to help you with the medication that you're taking, but that absolutely must be done in a controlled way with your healthcare provider. So thank you for watching tonight. Hope this has been of interest as usual. And I look forward to catching up with you next Tuesday, which, if you're watching this live, is the 21st of November. Have a great week, everyone. Take care.